Well, I think we'll get started. Welcome, everyone, to this edition of K-State Research and Extension, Johnson County's Silver Clover Program. Today's topic is growing herbs, culinary herbs indoors. Um, it's one of our last for 2020, and hopefully everyone, we have folks that received a kit with some materials to follow along with some demonstrations that we'll do today. And then some of you may not have received that kit, but I think there still be some opportunity for you guys to follow along with us. Obviously, with some of the information, we'll do a short lecture in the beginning, and then follow that up with some demonstration towards the end, and some opportunity for Q&A. I should introduce myself. My name is Zac Hoppenstedt, and I'm a horticulture extension agent in the Johnson County office. I'm joined today by my colleague and fellow horticulturist, Dennis Patton. And what we just discussed, hey Dennis, how are you? Is that probably the easiest way, because it's kind of immersive when you're doing these presentations, and in full disclosure, because I thought it would only be right to do so for growing herbs indoors or growing herbs at home, that I be at home and try to do all the technology required to teach this class here in my living room. That it's probably easier that if you have questions as we go along, to put those in the chat box. Dennis is going to be watching the chat box, and he'll interrupt me as we go. But for the most part, we'll keep everybody on mute until we have some time at the end for Q&A. But if you do have a question as we go, please put those in the chat box. And I know that Dennis will find a way to interrupt me if we need to as we go. So let's get started. Today's agenda, we have an hour together, a little less than that now. We're going to talk about basic propagation methods, which is a word that I'll use a lot and is horticulture jargon for it basically just means reproducing plants. So we'll talk about the different methods for starting and reproducing plants. We'll talk about some of the best practices for taking care of established herbs and growing seedlings, and some of the materials and tools, obviously, that we sent out in the kits. But just generally, what are some of the equipment options that are available for a small home herb garden? After we start with this lecture, we'll do a little bit of demonstration, and like I said, a little bit of time for Q&A at the end. What makes an herb? In general, herbs are plants that serve as a major source of seasoning in food preparation. In a broader sense, herbs include plants that are also useful for scents and cosmetics or for medicinal purposes. For the purposes of this class, we'll be focused mostly on those that are used as seasonings for food. For American pioneers, they were used for curing illnesses, storing with linens, as sort of a deodorant, strewing on floors, covering the bad taste of meats before refrigeration was devised, dyeing homespun fabrics, and as fragrances, for a little bit of historical context. But I think with the advent of supermarkets growing herbs, people producing herbs at home has sort of declined. And it's cyclical, of course, and now it seems to be there's an increasing interest, especially in this pandemic times, for homesteading and producing more fresh foods and culinary supplements at home, like fresh herbs. And I think we all know that the quality of fresh herbs grown at home can be significantly better than the dried herbs that we have in the pantry, or even sometimes what we can get at the grocery store. Herbs, what I think makes herbs really a suitable plant category for indoor edible production is that we're largely consuming the foliage of herb species. And so the conditions of indoor growing make it difficult to produce flowers and fruits for certain types of edibles. But because we're mostly focused on foliage or the leaves for herb production, it kind of makes the indoor grow environment, which is usually a little slower, more suitable for herb production. We'll focus on sort of the probably 5 to 10 common species that are used for cooking. They fall into a few different botanical groups, some that are perennial, meaning they can, their lifespan is indefinite. Some that are annual, that really their life cycle takes place in 1 year, or biennial, where it's a 2 year lifespan. And some of those distinctions are important if you're just growing them indoors. But if you plan on taking them outdoors at certain periods, bedding them in ground in your garden, and then bringing them back in the winter, those are the perennial herbs like thyme, rosemary, sage. Those are those perennial herbs are going to be more suitable for that. Whereas you may just get a few months of production from annual herbs like basil or cilantro, parsley, and reseed those every couple of months for more harvest. Let's really quickly think about what are the key factors for promoting plant growth, because some of the materials that we'll be going over will hopefully help us achieve um, these requirements that plants need to grow. So light and heat are very important factors for plant growth, and herbs are no different. Nutrients, when we think of nutrients, we're usually talking about some sort of fertilizer. In general, herbs have a very low fertility requirement. And when we talk about the potting mix, like the bags of potting soil that some of the folks who received kits got, well, some of those potting mixes will already have a built-in fertility, and generally herbs grown indoors are not going to require a lot of extra fertilizer applications. Day length is not going to be a major consideration for indoor herb growth, because we're, like I said, mostly looking to produce foliage. Um, Day length and adjusting day length, making shorter day periods or longer day periods with artificial lighting, can be important if you're trying to force flowering or produce fruit in certain types of crops that you grow inside. And generally speaking, we're always trying to find a tipping point in between. A little bit of stress, like providing a little air circulation, is one way that we could think of stress that helps produce a stockier plant with a stronger main stem. But letting our herb plants go weeks without watering is probably too much stress and is going to lead to a decline. But we're always trying to find that balance. So key considerations for growing herbs at home is how you propagate or how you reproduce the plant, what sort of lighting source you have, the potting medium that you use, um, the containers that you use, some of the common pests and disease for indoor herb production, and then finally the most important part, harvesting. Materials and tools. Like I said, some of you guys that received kits, you have some of these materials on hand. Maybe those of you who are had just signed up to view the class were able to get some of these prior to today's class. Generally speaking, seed's a really great way to start herbs at home, especially for the annual species that I mentioned previously, basil, um, cilantro, um, let's see, parsley. Those would be really great herbs to start from seed. Substrate, that's just a fancy word for some sort of growing medium. Soil or a soilless potting mix works really great because it's able to hold moisture, but it also lets air penetrate, and it gives structure for the roots to develop and keep the plants standing up straight. Pots, trays, etc. Most of the participants in today's class will have received a little plug tray and a basin, and that's just one technique, but it can be, we'll go over some other more DIY or more low-tech methods for providing some sort of structure to hold your potting mix. And then obviously, germination equipment in this case would be the heat pad that you received to help create ideal soil temperatures, that really will help speed up the germination process if you're starting from seed, or it will help roots develop if you're starting a plant from a cutting. Um, Generally able to get in between 70 and 80 degrees with those heat pads. Watering, usually we're trying to let the plants dry out a little bit, but not so much that they go, like I said, days or weeks without watering. But usually if you stick your first knuckle or so with your index finger into the soil and it feels bone dry, it's time to water. And light is going to be the most important part for indoor growing. The main propagation methods for culinary herbs are going to be seed, like I mentioned, cuttings, which we'll go over in one of the demonstrations. Divisions we won't do so much of today, but it'll be similar to repotting a plant like the rosemary plant that some of you guys received in today's class, and then layering. And I'll just mention layering is probably one of the easiest ways to reproduce an already established herb plant like this spearmint plant that I have here. When you have a long stem like this, if you can make contact with the stem and the potting soil, and in this case, I'm already getting into a little bit of demonstration here, but I buried a small plug tray here inside of my larger pot. And if I can just lay a stem on top of that soil, then the plant does all the work for me. It roots itself into that little plug container, and then I can cut the plant once it's set roots there, and I have another plant. I've got a clone of my already established plant. Propagules, fancy word of just saying, what sort of plant part are we using? Starting from transplant can be a really great way to get started. Starting from seed can take a little bit more time. And so it's surprising, but a lot of local nurseries here in Johnson County will carry herb transplants really all year round. They're usually grown in greenhouses, but some of the herbs behind me are ones that I brought indoors from the growing season this summer and fall, or ones that I started from seed here at home. But several of these in the white containers came from a local nursery, and there's nothing better than if you're interested in starting to grow herbs, then getting a small container plant like this of dill, for example. You already have an established plant that you can harvest from, and with a few of the supplies that were provided in the kit, you can get that plant to last for months. And you spent $2.99 on it, as opposed to buying maybe bundles of dill every couple of weeks at the grocery store, which would have probably been more expensive. Cuttings we'll go over starting from pieces of stem or rhizome, underground stems, or even root cuttings. So lavender, lemon balm, sage, rosemary, those are examples of herbs that we commonly start from cuttings. Divisions are more when we have herb that reproduces from a crown, and so it's constantly sending up new shoots from the base. And so we can separate those and multiply the quantity of plants that we have. And that's something that we commonly do outdoors. Chives is a really great example. Chives isn't actually typically reproducing from the base, but the flower heads are reseeding themselves. And so the clumps of chives end up getting bigger and bigger, and they can kind of become invasive and take over a space. And so in the spring, when we're growing chives outdoors, we actually separate the roots, dig out the chive plant, separate it, and then we gift it to someone, or we put it in another place in the garden. And that's one way that we're able to multiply the amount of plants that we have. Layering, something that I kind of went over by, laying a stem that already has some foliage or flowers growing on it, making contact with the soil. You could use a landscape staple to hold it in place. And then the mother plant, the main plant, is keeping it alive. It's helping push water and nutrients from the soil through the mother plant. And then as soon as it sets root into another container or another spot in the garden, then you're able to make a cut and separate it from that mother plant. And now you have a separate planting, a reproduction or a clone. And then one method that we won't really get into are tubers, so underground storage organs, kind of like how we reproduce a potato from pieces of potato cuttings. The same thing can be said with ginger and turmeric, which are really popular seasonings for curries, for example, and those are reproduced from those from the fleshy underground stem that we commonly consume when we purchase those. Mint is another example. We'll actually do a little during the demonstration. We'll do a reproduction from a mint stolon as well as a mint stem. Growing from seed, pros, you get exactly what you want. You're able to select the variety that you want. There's a lot more diversity in variety when you're going to a seed store or seed catalog, and you're able to select from, creeping, rosemary, more erect varieties, different types of basils. I think some of you guys got purple basil, for example. So instead of starting from cutting, which you just have available what's on hand or what's being grown at the nursery, this gives you a little bit more option in terms of diversity of varieties that you have to select from. Um, Generally speaking, when you're starting from seed, there's less chance for disease carryover. When you're starting from cuttings, you do have the potential, especially when you're like taking things from the grocery store and trying to root, basil or mint. There's just a lot more potential for contaminants, bacteria, fungi that could be present on the bunch when you purchase it. When you're starting from seed, there's kind of a built-in disease protection. And then potentially spending less, but that's not always the case. And we'll talk a little bit about why sometimes you definitely, with certain varieties of herbs, starting from cuttings is just so much more time efficient that you have to kind of build that into your budget if you're doing it at scale. Does require time, space, and using a high quality potting mix can sometimes be difficult to find, but I would say if you're trying to find it in large quantities locally, that could be an issue. But like the 8-quart bag that those of you that got a kit received, that's really low cost. It's a good quality and it's usually readily available. And like I said, seed companies can be a really great resource. This is a cutout from the Fedco Seed catalog. They're based in the New England area, and they provide really great recommendations on the hardiness. So when I say hardiness, I'm talking about to what growing zone. We're in a growing zone 6. To what growing zone is the plant hardy and will overwinter if it's a perennial? How many days to germination? What temperature does it prefer when germinating seed? How much should you cover the seed? Do you need to just rake it in? Should you lightly cover it with soil? So some of these recommendations you can find from the seed company, and it's actually a really helpful resource. I like this one a lot from Fedco Seed. Propagation from cutting, which is something we'll go over in detail in our demonstration. Some herbs multiply asexually, so instead of flower and pollen and fertilization of the flower and production of seed, we're really just taking a clone. We're taking something off of the new growth or the tip growth. Typically that soft area on rosemary specifically, that softer stem that's newer growth is going to root more quickly. And generally speaking, whether we're trying to root sage or lavender or rosemary, we're probably with some of those hardwood perennial herbs, at least 2 to 4 weeks. And we'll talk about how to speed that up a little bit, but it takes a little bit of time to root those plants. After rooting them, we're going to overwinter them indoors in pots, in a sunny window, or in a cold frame. I'm usually waiting for that shift from, you'll see they can look sort of soft and bent over the first couple weeks when you start a cutting, and it's because they don't have the roots to move water through their system and keep that erectness or turgor that will help, that makes the plant stand up straight. And as soon as you start to see them standing up more and putting on new growth, that's usually a signal that it's time to get them in light. Some of the equipment for starting seed or for starting plants from cuttings is going to be low light generally, especially with a cutting. The first few weeks, you don't want to expose it to really intense sunlight. You want to give it time to develop a root system and start moving water and nutrients through its vascular system before you start exposing it to a lot of light. You're not wanting it to perform a lot of photosynthesis in that period. You're really just wanting it to put its energy into producing new roots. If you're starting from seed, low light similarly is a good tip. Generally speaking, most of the herb seed that you would be starting indoors at home will benefit from ambient low light to no light. Doesn't need to be completely dark generally. And the seed, when it's covered with soil, which would be my general recommendation, a light covering of soil, that also will help block out the light a little bit. Germination mats, those germination mats that you received will help keep the soil temperature a little higher than the ambient temperature in your house, which ideally is somewhere around 70 degrees. But I know, like, I live in an old house that's relatively pretty drafty, and if I'm standing next to the register or the vent in the floor, it might be 70 degrees. But where my containers holding my soil and seeds are sitting, maybe somewhere closer to 65 or 68 if I don't use that heat pad. And then humidity chambers, you all received a little dome. This isn't the exact dome that you received. This is actually shows you how, plastic is all around us, and you don't need anything fancy to create a humidity dome. This is like something that we got a mixed greens in, and so something to trap the humidity and moisture around the plants, cuttings, or seeds, and that'll help the soil from drying out, so you don't have to water very much in the first week or two after seeding your herbs. Sowing your seeds, planting depth, generally speaking, the planting depth of your seed is going to be about you want to cover it with as much soil as the diameter of the seed. So like with chamomile or thyme or oregano, these are really small seeds. And so you have to keep that in mind, that you really just have to very lightly cover them. Soil moisture is really important. Generally, we're going to water the soil before we put the seeds on. And then with a humidity dome like that, that's going to trap the moisture and keep the soil wet, probably most of the time until they germinate. And you're really looking for no fertilizers during this time, whether you're trying to root a cutting or start or germinate seed. The potting mix has a little bit of built-in low fertility that's slow release. You definitely don't need to add any more fertilizer during this period. And there's little tools like this hand seeder that you can get that can make handling smaller seeds a little bit easier. But I'll show you my technique in just a second here. And you don't need a fancy tool to do it. Some examples of what humidity tents look like at commercial scales, and then like obviously a small scale sandwich container like this, where you're able to create the humidity to either keep your soil moist to germinate seed or to promote rooting of your cutting. This is just showing you that if you want to invest a little bit more money, you can really fine tune the temperature of your soil and your rooting area in your containers in the potting mix with a digital thermostat that hooks up to your heating pads. So if you're trying to hit exactly 75 degrees, it'll turn off. You have a temperature probe in the soil in these containers underneath the domes, and as soon as it hits 75, the heating pads turn off. You can actually also get ones that will hook up to a fan, so a fan comes on and so they don't overheat. But generally speaking, with the heating pads that you guys received, those will just, without a thermostat, keep the soil temperature around 70 to 80 degrees. And this is a really low cost DIY method. Obviously, you can spend a little bit of money on these domes to go over your seeding trays. But sometimes I just use shopping bags that are relatively clean. And I just want to make sure that the soil moisture isn't building up on the underneath side of those. I don't want a lot of condensation, but but there's multiple ways to skin a cat, I guess you could say. Light is the most, I would say, one of the maybe the most important factors for plant growth, and it's hugely significant when we're talking about growing plants indoors, because regardless of whether you have a south or a west facing window, which is usually where the majority of direct sunlight will come in a home, you're probably not going to get the light quantity or quality that's required for healthy plant growth, especially for herbs, which largely are going to be high light plants. They're not like your low light indoor plants that can have indirect sunlight and sustain themselves. These plants are going to need a high intensity of light. And there are a lot of different methods and lighting options. We're going to focus mainly on LEDs, which have become increasingly affordable, are probably the most efficient option in terms of their energy usage and the low heat that they put off, available to a home consumer type audience. And really, when we look at the visible spectrum of light, in between 400 and 700 nanometers typically. For plant development, we're usually trying to target blue for vegetative growth. So that's going to be stems and leaves, and then more on the red spectrum for flower and fruiting, which won't be as important for most of the herbs that we're growing. You'll sometimes see a lot of light bulbs, whether it's a tube bulb or a compact fluorescent or just a general screw-in socket light bulb. They'll provide you some detail on the temperature of the light. So generally for the inside of our house, we're looking for that warmer temperature light, which is usually around 2,500 to 3,000 Kelvin. And then in a workspace or an office space, we're probably looking for something more cooler or daylight, sometimes in kitchen spaces too. And that's going to be 5,000 to anywhere to 6,500 Kelvin. And that's going to be on the cooler side. And so in terms of wavelength, nanometers, and then Kelvin, you kind of have to reverse those numbers. And I don't want to get too into the weeds there, but just like we would use a warmer light in the bedroom and a cooler light in the kitchen, that can be a good way to remember. Cooler light in the kitchen, cooler is blue. Blue is for leaves and herbs, and we'll keep those out of the bedroom. And I won't say anything more about that. But there's tools obviously that you can use to measure the light intensity, and what we're usually looking for growing lights is not how many lumen, because that, like in this previous slide, lumens are for humans. That's how bright something appears to the human eye, which is usually going to be more in the yellow spectrum. We're more interested in photosynthetic active radiation, which is the acronym PAR. And you can buy very expensive PAR meters. You can also there are free apps on your phone that'll help you measure lumens. Generally speaking, because you can get very into the weeds on grow lights, if you can shoot to have about 20 to 25 watts of LED wattage light bulb for a square foot space, that's usually going to be adequate for a high light plant, like an edible plant or an herb plant. And so, for example, the light that you guys received in your kits is 9 watts. And that was selected to correspond with the small containers that you received, which are about 6 inches by 6 inches. So about a quarter of a square foot. And so it's actually a little bit more light than you need, but that's just a good rule of thumb. This is an example of kind of what my kitchen garden looks like. And I have a south facing window. It gives me some of the light I need, and I can get direct light on like these cilantro and parsley herbs, that seedlings that I'm starting there in the windowsill. But like I said, about 4 hours of direct sunlight, and then after 1 or 2 in the afternoon, I'm supplementing that with this grow light, with the clamp light fixture. This is what you're trying to avoid. If you don't provide adequate light, you're going to get very elongated, stretched out plants. They're stretching towards the light, and they'll never develop a strong base or stem, and will not perform for you. Fluorescents, definitely an option and definitely provide a good light spectrum for plants. You have tube options, you have the compact fluorescent, and these will work, but they require so much more wattage, and they still, like, obviously they're cooler than incandescent bulbs, but they're still so much warmer than LEDs. LEDs require so much less wattage. You may have this concept that LEDs have to be this blue and red, which I did mention are the spectrum that we're targeting for plant growth. And so commercial growers will use those dual band lights that really look purple or like aliens are coming into your house. But there's so many options now that I'm sure all of you have started to replace some of the bulbs in your homes with a white balanced spectrum LED that looks just like the incandescents that you had previously. Those can be very suitable for growing herbs indoors. And this just shows you like how close you need to keep, whether it's fluorescent or LED. For something like a seedling, this is a thyme seedling, requires a lot of light intensity, and so we're keeping those. This is a T5 light tube, and it's about an inch away from the plants. This just really quickly, just to give you some ideas on sort of larger scale growing setups that are modular on racks. Like there's, you can see behind me, I have this is about a 2 foot by 14 inch, about a 2 foot by 1 foot kitchen metal shelving unit that I use for starting seeds. Obviously larger scale options. Taking your plants outside when you have nice weather is really a great idea. These are called cold frames. If you have like an old window frame that is, you know, left over or that you salvage somewhere, you can make these quite cheaply, and they can allow you to, instead of having to utilize artificial light, take plants outside but still keep warm temperatures for the root and the above ground portion of the plant. But the class was really based on this concept of, okay, there's a lot of these commercial products now available for countertop gardens. I think this one is called the Click and Grow. And the idea was like, yes, they're very tailored to do one type of thing. Usually seeds come in a plug, like a 1 inch by 1 inch soil plug that has the seed in there, and really requires you to know nothing about growing a plant. And so the idea was, could we develop a kit? And there's other systems out there like that can maybe fit underneath a kitchen cabinet, or you can install an LED or a fluorescent tube underneath the shelving in your kitchen. But we wanted to try to come up with something that we thought would allow people to experiment and do different things, not just necessarily grow herbs. This is a DIY method that if you're interested, I'll send out some information after the class later for how to build your own light stand, just using a standard 4-foot shop light fixture, some chains, some S-hooks, and then this is 1.5 inch PVC tubing. The whole setup, including the lights, which are LEDs, and the reflector, the PVC, comes to a total of $45. But this still takes up a lot of space. You can see all the individual components. You can see it with a white LED. You can see it with the ET Phone Home LEDs. You can see where those are probably better suited, which are these kind of large commercial vertical farms. And there's a lot of ways to make low wattage lights to direct the intensity of that light more towards your plants, you know, using Rubbermaid storage containers and tin foil. Obviously there's commercial grow boxes like you can see on the left that are lined with reflective material. But I think this would probably be a good time for us to get into the demonstration. We focused a lot on light, obviously, and the different ways of reproducing herbs. And so for the demonstration today, we're going to be using potting mix. You can use, this is a soilless potting mix, meaning it doesn't have any native soil or soil from the garden or even compost. It's a mostly sterile mix. It's going to have largely peat, perlite, and a little bit of sand, I believe, in the mix that we got for the kits. You can get one that is a seed starting mix. This is just a general potting mix, so you'll see there's some large particulate in it that we'll remove as we go along. But I think this would probably be a good time for us to get out our soil bags. And so I'll move over to my work table here, and we'll stop sharing our screen. Any questions so far, Dennis? I'm seeing none in the chat.
Yeah, the only really one is I've got a couple of direct messages to me. They really were enticed by your $45 so they would really love for you to make sure you send that out to the people signed up after the class is over, so they have that. And I'm going to see if I can find that K-State has that Make Your Own Grow Light video. I'm going to go see if I can find that and post a link to that if you're okay with that.
Yeah, that would be great. It looked like the Kansas Healthy Yards website was actually down. They might be doing some maintenance. And so I was having some issue. That link was probably, it might be down right now, but I'm sure it's just a matter of time before they get it back up.
Okay, I'll go check. Do you move the trays from low light to high light as soon as the seeds germinate? So when do you transfer them to higher light?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I mean, generally speaking, you're going to have sort of waves of germination that are going to happen. So you'll start to see one or two of your, chive leaf blades starting to pop out of the soil. And basically, as soon as I see one or two bits of green, the first little bits of the cotyledons coming out of the germinating plant, or even just the hypocotyl, the stem that's bending up and starting to break the soil, I try to get those underneath light pretty much as soon as I see any germination. And it'll usually just be like, let's say you seeded 200 basil plants in a container like this. As soon as I start to see 10 or 20 of them start to come up, a very small percentage, then I want to try to get them underneath light as soon as possible. So let's move over to the table here. I'm going to turn off my video here and turn on my video here. And my host has to enable my video. Okay. So hopefully you guys can see me now on that video. So starting with a good potting mix. Let's see. You all should have received this premium potting mix here, which is pretty standard general potting mix. And what we're going to do is we're going to start all of you guys received seed, some variation of herb seed. You all received mint cuttings and a rosemary plant. And so there's two things we'll do, and we'll probably start with the rosemary and filling both of our containers. So right here is talking about containers a little bit. This is kind of a standard technique for starting seed, are these small plug trays like this. This allows us to start more plants in a smaller space. This is, relatively, like I said, about a 5 by 7 inch rectangle container, and it has 12 plugs in it. And each of the plugs has a little drainage hole. And you can hopefully see that there. And then this basin allows for water to drain out of the bottom so your roots aren't sitting in water. And it also allows you, like if you, in a pinch, you can bottom water instead of having to water over the top of the plants where you may have really fine seed. This allows you to add water to the bottom, and the sort of capillary nature of the potting soil is going to bring that moisture up, and it's not going to disrupt the seeds as much. So one thing that we'll start with is just kind of filling this 6 tray container here. I'm going to get a little dirty here on the table. And then I'll move underneath the overhead here in just a second. But I'm really just trying to loosely, gently drop this in. And it kind of leaves a bit of hills and mounds and everything here. And then I'll go underneath the camera here. And let's see. You guys are hopefully seeing an overhead shot now. But I'll just try to smooth this over. This mix is sort of pre-moistened. As you pour it out at home, you might notice that there's some sort of, they call it forest material in the nursery industry, which just means there's like kind of larger pieces of stick. And there's some clumps and things. Mine sat outside and froze and thawed. But I'm just trying to kind of level it out. And I don't want to put a ton of pressure. Like, I don't want to pack it down like that necessarily, but I will just kind of come and just lightly tap it in. And that's going to be just the right density like that. And if I push down a little too hard here and there, you know, I can just grab underneath and I can kind of squeeze, just like if I'm trying to lift out a plant once it's done. It's the same thing I would do there. And now that's not quite as compacted, and I might just kind of level it out. You can see there's some sticks, you know, here and there. Those aren't going to be ideal for some of your fine seeds, but it'll work. You can remove them. It really won't be a major deal, but a potting mix that's designed for starting seeds is usually going to be very fine. This has a little bit more larger particulate, but otherwise it is very suitable for what we're going to do. Okay, the other thing that we got, everybody should have received a rosemary plant. These rosemary plants were started from cuttings. They were actually started from a farm where I get my CSA, and who does a lot of herb transplants for sale locally, called Green Gate Farm. Check them out if you're not familiar with them. And Katie Nixon and her husband, Ken, have, you know, they grow a variety of different produce items, but they're the ones that that gave us all these rosemary plants. And so you should have also received, let's see, a fairly large, like a 5-inch planter like this, which would be a more permanent location for your rosemary plant. And so we're also going to fill that up with soil. And what I'm doing with my container, because I think I'm actually going to put in 2, and I may even try to do like a little topiary rosemary project here, where I don't know if any of you guys have seen these Christmas tree topiary rosemaries that people do around the holiday, but I'm actually going to put 2. I have a slightly larger container than you guys have. Generally, these are called 3-inch planters right here, and they're a step up. They're probably like, if I'm moving from one of these plugs and I'm transplanting into something like this, and then when it starts to, my plant starts to grow past its space in this pot, then I'm moving to something like a 5-inch container, especially for an indoor herb garden. Regardless of what herb you're growing, 5 inches is probably going to be suitable. I think you guys have 5.5. This is a little larger. I would say this is more like 6.5. And so I'm going to do 2 plants in this. And what I need to do is I need to backfill this with a little bit of soil, because I want these root balls to be sitting almost flush. I don't want soil higher on the stem than it already is. And so I need to build up a little bit of soil down here first. And so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take that same bag of potting mix, and I'm going to fill up my container, and probably going to fill it up about 1/3 of the way. And then I just kind of test it to see where it's at, and I'm still a little low. I really want to be like right here. And so I need to fill up it a little bit more. And you can see this is a little bit more of a traditional rosemary variety that stands up straight. It's definitely ideal for doing that sort of topiary style Christmas tree rosemary. I have another variety. I'm getting pretty close there. Keep in mind though, these are always going to sink a little bit more. So I'll probably put in just a little bit more. Isn't this entertaining, guys? Hopefully educational too. They're always going to sink a little bit. And you can see if yours are anything like mine, they've probably become a little bit root bound here. And so you don't need to, there's no real special one way to do this, but generally speaking, I try to go, if it's a cube, I try to go from all four sides and I try to just break up those roots just a little bit and so I just really don't want the roots to end up circling the plant, the rooting area so much that it starts to choke out the plant. But I just disrupt the roots a little bit here. And now I'm gonna set those down. And I like where they're sitting. They're pretty much flush with the top of the container. And I'm gonna put one on this side, and I'm gonna put the other one on the other side. And I'm gonna kind of break it up the same exact way. And I may end up separating these again if I put them out next year. Or like I said, try pruning them to kind of create the shape of your preference. Rosemary is kind of cool like that. But what I was saying is, you know, this is a very straight up and down variety. You also have creeping rosemary that looks a little bit more like this, where this can really work really nice outdoors, like in some sort of rock garden where you'd like some more texture and something that's kind of creeping, creeping at the base of the garden as sort of a lower understory type planting. And now I'm just going to backfill around these plants. I've got them right where I want. And I get these guys in place. They're going to be so much happier because they've got more space for their roots. They're going to be able to hold moisture. I mean, I don't know about you guys, but I tried watering these a little bit over the last couple of days, and they just had become so full in the container that they just weren't even holding water. Well, see how we're doing for time. Okay, so I filled that up, and you can kind of see where I'm at there. Like I said, I'm really just trying to get those plants to sit maybe about 1/8 of an inch below the edge of the pot, but I pretty much want as much of that main stem exposed as was in the previous container. I don't want to build up so much soil around it like this to where I potentially have some rot or leaf drop from that above ground portion getting too wet. So that probably a lot of you guys have already done before, but that ideally should be a plant that you can use. Could be the one herb plant that you try to get to overwinter this year. Rosemary, obviously very, very hardy, but not always able to overwinter in our growing zone. And so, you know, setting up the grow light so that we're just sitting right over, and hopefully am I spotlighted on this video right here with the iPad. Just having this an inch or two above the plant to try to get some good coverage over it will be suitable if you can't get direct sunlight from your window. But now that we have the rosemary in front of us, it's probably a good time to experiment with taking some cuttings. So the cuttings are going to go into the plug tray that we filled originally right here. And what we would say 3 to 5 inches for typical cutting for rosemary. In this case, I'm really thinking more about what is the depth of the container that I'm going to put it into. And I want pretty balanced ratio of the amount of stem that I'm going to put inside the container versus how much is going to be above. And I'm also trying to get some of the softer, greener, more flexible wood, which may not be totally possible. So in this case, I would say I'm looking at maybe something in the 3 to 4 inch range. And I'm gonna do 4 cuttings because we have 12 plugs. So I'm gonna take roughly, and when I take a cutting, I'm looking to do it right. I'm gonna show you, let's see if I can do this in the overhead here. Um, I'm looking to take a cutting right below a node, and I'll show you what I mean when I say that. And I wanna make like a 45-degree angle cut, and I'll show you what I mean. These axles where the leaves are coming out off here, let's see, I'm gonna remove those. And you can see what's left over is a stem node right here. And I like to have one, like within a quarter to an eighth of an inch to my cut. That's where a lot of root development is going to happen. And I'm going to remove probably at least half of the rosemary foliage, and it smells so good. And now I've exposed another node here where we had a leaf axle. And I'm probably going to do another one. And this is more than enough space here. And it's fairly new growth. It's fairly flexible. And really, I'm just going to put it inside my moist potting soil. But that reminds me, this potting mix came pre-moistened. But mine, like I said, it sat outside for a little while, and I started to notice that some of the bags we gave out were starting to get a little dry. This would be a great time before we move any further to wet the potting mix in the plug tray. And the same can be said about the larger rosemary plant that we just potted up. So hopefully you guys can see this okay. I like these little sort of gooseneck style watering cans, and I just try to get it really close. I don't want to like throw soil and water all over the place, but I want to get a nice soaking, and I almost always do it. There's some cases where I might wet the soil before I even fill this, and that would be with a potting mix that's really dry and doesn't want to accept water. It's hydrophobic. This has some sort of natural wetting agent in it, so it's holding water really easily. But sometimes you get those dry potting mixes, and if you don't wet them before you fill this container, it's just a mess. The water will just sit on top. But this one's accepting water really well. In this case, if some of them sunk down a little bit, I might take a handful and just fill up some of these areas. I don't need to water again. They're going to fill up. They're going to, that moisture is going to transfer. And now it's very moist. And so it's a great time for me to take that rosemary cutting, and I'm just going to pop it in, and I'm going to take it as far down as I can go, which basically was looks like maybe 1.5 inches deep. And I'm going to take 3 more cuttings and do the exact same thing. And I'm going to try to take it off some of these areas on the rosemary plant that are a little bit larger, because I want kind of a more compact shape. And that also has to do with lighting, because if you're using one light or a couple of lights to grow seed or to provide the light requirements for a plant, if you have main stems that are 3-4 inches difference in height, then it's going to be hard to put that light in one central location that's going to hit all of them at the same time. So I like to keep more of a standardized height in terms of how I prune. And that goes like for harvesting as well. And so I'm going to stick another one. And immediately you're going to feel like you're so accomplished, because you're going to look at this and you're going to be like, oh my gosh, I've got, 4 new rosemary plants right here. They are going to go through sort of a sad, wilted, pathetic period, though. I'm going to warn you that. But I'm going to take another cutting here. And rosemary is just one of those herbs that roots really well. There are some that don't do as well as others. Sage is an example where, like, I will root from sage cuttings, but sage is also so easy to propagate from seed. Rosemary takes quite a bit of time. Like if you're starting rosemary seed for planting outside, I almost always am starting in December, because I'm not even going to have a plant the size of these cuttings in the plug tray right now until probably April at the earliest. I mean, it just takes so much time to develop. And so if you have a plant that produces good roots from cuttings, and also takes a lot of time from seed, I think it's best to opt for the cutting. Rosemary is a great example of that. My main plant looks a little butchered, but it's still got some decent shape to it. And like I said, I probably just, if Dennis Patton's on the call, then I better not forget water in this new transplant, because you'll forget to do it otherwise. And it never rains indoors. That's the thing. I didn't say that to you guys, but that's a really important thing to remember. I always forget that, unless you have a hole in your roof, which I did at one point.
Hey, Zach, do you want to take a couple questions real quick?
Yeah.
One of the questions that came in is on the starting trays you're using.
Mm-hmm.
Can those be recycled? Can you sterilize and reuse them?
Yeah, absolutely. And I mean, sterilize is a strong word. If you want to do like a 1 part bleach, 10 part water, or I think it's actually 1:9 ratio. That's one really easy way to sanitize. I just wash with a little gentle detergent and warm water, and I generally am able to manage. I don't have a lot of disease issues with recycling some of these plug trays. And these are the same type of plug trays, the sizes at least, that a standard tray for the nursery is going to be a 10x20 tray. And inside that 10-20 tray, there are usually these inserts. And I'll show you. I'm reusing the same basin for some mint cuttings, which we'll get into here shortly. Or actually here, I'll show you what I prefer for starting herbs. If you don't have this, these are usually readily available. They're recycled at the nursery a lot. And are we in the overhead camera here? So these are some seeds that I just started recently. And you can see that they come in these little 6-packs. And these are the same size cells as the 12 that you have. You actually have 2 of them in these containers. And this is a pretty standard size. And you can fit, let me see if I can do my math here correctly. You can fit 12 of these 6-cell containers in a 10x20 flat. And so let me do my math. What is that? Is that 72? What is it? Mm-hmm. 7 times 5 is 60 plus. 72. So forget about my math. But anyway, that's a really standardized container. Recycle them. I reuse these all the time. Okay. And they're really nice for starting seed.
2 more questions.
Yes.
You did not use like a rooting hormone?
No, I did not. You can use a rooting hormone. Rosemary is not a herb that really requires it. It can speed up the process a little bit. And there are some cuttings that are going to be really finicky and are going to be very difficult to root, and rooting hormone can be helpful for those. For rosemary, that's not the case. You can get away without it, and that's why we selected it for this demonstration.
Do you need to mist the cuttings?
We're going to get to that. That. I know we're getting close to time here, but we might run, I promise, no longer than 10 or 15 over. Keep going. Anything else?
What about if the plant's blooming? What do you do with the flowers?
Usually, I would say do not take the cutting from a inflorescent part of the plant or a part that has a bloom or flower on it. Try to select a section that is mostly vegetative or mostly leaf matter. And the reason why, just in a generic botanical or biological sense, is that you don't want any sort of energy suck coming from sustaining the life of that flower or trying to go to seed. So ideally selecting it from parts of the plant that are not going to flower.
Or I've always heard remove the flowers too. If it's
Yep. Uh-huh.
And the last comment before I let you move on is, can you take cuttings of thyme?
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'll show you guys some cuttings of thyme as well. And it definitely, I mean, if you want to talk about rooting hormone, if you're going to take a woodier section of the plant, which sometimes is like hard to get away from depending on when you're taking the cutting, later in the season, you may not have access to as much of the green new growth. That's where rooting hormone can be more helpful. And that can sometimes be an issue with both rosemary and thyme. Let's move on to the mint. So everybody that received a kit today should have received some rather kind of ghastly looking soil-filled bags that have some chocolate mint stems and rhizomes. And it may be hard to distinguish what is the stem and what is the rhizome. My little whiteboard's getting kind of messy here. And it looks like I have mostly stems. Rhizome is an underground stem. So what I just wanted you guys to be aware of is that in your bag, we tried to set it up so that you have some green stem sections. Those are gonna be parts of the plant that were mostly above the ground. And then you're gonna have some that are kind of more pale or white. And they're actually probably putting off more growth. This isn't a piece of chocolate mint, but it's a spearmint plant that I have. And you probably, if you have some of these white pale stems, are going to look kind of similar to this, where you see a lot of nodes and leaf development. These are like the easiest sections on mint to reproduce from, are these rhizomes. And with a section like this is like the perfect piece right here. It's probably like 2.5 inches at most. I'm just going to stick this like right in the potting mix, and I'll leave some of these leaves exposed, but the tissue in these stems is so apt for reproduction. It's going to happen so quick. And so like regardless of whether you have mostly green stem or you have this pale stem that I'm talking about, I would shoot to do the same thing. I'm trying to take like probably no more than 3 inches of a cutting. I'm trying to get at least one node, which is right here where you can see this shoot coming out. And in this case, I've already got a lot of root development. Now, I'll be honest with you, it's the same thing as if you root things in water, which we haven't talked about a lot. You definitely can produce roots that way, but they're not going to be the same. They're not going to have the same health or architecture as roots that are produced in a potting media are going to have. And so some of these may just end up dropping, but this has definitely got a head start in terms of how quick it will be to send out new shoots. It's already got some root development. It may have to develop some more. You can see this little piece down here is kind of decayed and brown. And so same thing I did with the rosemary, I'm going to do a 45-degree cut. If you have an X-Acto knife, you'll see in some propagation workshops where they'll encourage you to use a very sharp knife, because you want to make as clean a cut as possible. That's going to help water move through the tissue and help root development happen. In this case, I'm not super concerned because mint can be like overtake a garden. It's so reproductive. And I'm going to stick that in too. And generally, I'm trying to match the height of my rosemary and my mint. The mint's a little bit lower, but I know those are going to take off really quickly. And so regardless of whether you have green stem or you have some of the underground rhizome stems that I mentioned, I'm just looking to try to find sections where I have nodes or areas where branches are coming off the main stem. And so like, here's another example where, and I have some like leaf growth happening here that I kind of like, and I might try to keep. And I have a little natural break in the stem where it's kind of bending. I want to really like full turgid stem, and I want to make sure I have clean cuts on both ends potentially. In this case, like I said, 2 to 3 inches. This little side branch has some foliage on it, but it's pretty rough and brown. So I just might remove it. And now I've got one little bit of leaf here. I've got a node here, and I've got two clean cuts at the top and the bottom. I can already see some root development happening along the stem. I'm just going to stick that in the soil. So now I've got 3 out of my 4. And I'll take one more. This is definitely more of a kind of a hybrid here. It was above ground, it's green. You can see some of the roots that were, like we were talking about layering. This is a perfect example of layering right here, where this above ground stem was laying on the soil, and so it started to send out roots. And in that case, if it was still connected to the mother plant, I could make a cut right here, and I'd have a new plant rooted in that space. In this case, I'm probably going to just make another small cut right here, right above where I have these branches in the node. And it looks a little wonky, but I'm just gonna stick that right in there. And that's my mint planting, okay? And I'll give you a little before and after, because I thought, why not? These were some chocolate mint plantings that we did probably about, I know exactly, 9 days ago. And they're already starting to send out a lot of new growth. They're ready for light. They were in a really low light humidity chamber that you guys received. I want to make sure that I talk about that a little bit. You guys all got this humidity chamber. It has a little insert that fits right in the top. You just click it in. That helps you either vent or close the humidity dome, and that creates good, that's enough humidity for mint. For rosemary, I've already pre-moistened the soil. The rosemary is going to take longer to root, and it's not going to get probably as much moisture as it would like through the stem. And so I'm going to take my handy misting bottle here, and I'm probably going to apply a little bit of mist onto the foliage of the rosemary before I put this humidity dome on. And I'll probably put it on my heat pad as well, which I don't have handy with me right now, but those of you that received it, let's see, I can grab it really quick. And I'm probably going to put these cuttings on the heat pad, and that's going to also help speed up the rooting process, which these heating pads it's a 10 by 20, just like the standard tray size. It plugs in, has a little cord here, and that usually goes on my my seedling shelf. So, but we have one more propagation technique that we're going to go over. You all should have received a pack of seeds. I talked a little bit about seeding, and I'm trying to think what I have enough here. I think all the participants received, it was either parsley, cilantro, chives, thyme. There was a couple varieties of basil. And so I'll just show you what my approach to seeding looks like with, I might want to pick some really fine seed here to use. The finest seed that I have is actually these little alpine strawberries, but that probably seems a little out of place. But I think I have some chamomile seed, which chamomile seed, if you've never seeded it before, is like, I mean, you can barely feel that you have it in your hand. It's so tiny. But I'm going to take my seed pack, I'm going to open it up, and I generally have a pretty good idea of how much I need. And I'm going to show you a technique called overseeding. You probably noticed when I showed some of the seed that I had started recently that there were a lot of plants in each plug. And that would be my approach for indoor gardening. If you want to produce plants to take outside for transplants, then 1 or 2. You want to be able to give the plants space. For container gardening and indoor gardening, I'm going to go pretty heavy. And so I don't know if you can see this, but it's like I'm taking sea salt and I'm seasoning my steak or I put salt on everything, so you know, could be it could be anything really. But I'm doing a very heavy sprinkling of this chamomile seed, and I'll show you up close what that looks like. And as I recall, chamomile takes at least 10 to 14 days to germinate. So I don't like mixing so much containers like this. I'd almost prefer to just pick one thing and have the whole container devoted to it. But I'll show you what my workaround is for that really quick. So you can see it's quite a bit, quite densely seeded there, okay? And in most cases, there's kind of two methods for getting good seed to soil contact. It could be as simple as sort of raking in the seed. In this case, I'm just using a Sharpie pen that I might use to label. And I'm just kind of like raking it in, and I'm really just pressing it in. And I don't even need to cover this seed. And that really is probably, and I'm starting to find some larger chunks here, like with chamomile seed, I probably want to remove some of these larger chunks. I'm just pressing this down, and this will be fine. But 9 times out of 10, the really foolproof method would be to take just a small handful of the potting mix that hasn't been wetted, and I just am really putting a gentle dusting. And remember I said, I don't want to cover the seeds with any more depth than they are wide in diameter. And I mean, we're talking about a hundredth of a millimeter here. They're very tiny, and so I'm just doing a very light covering, and I might be able to still see them. And really, I just combined both the methods, so I may have actually negated the effectiveness. No, I'm just kidding. That's going to work. Both of those methods are fine. The soil's moist. The seeds are going to have enough moisture for germination. My cuttings are going to be moist and have the rosemary specifically have water on the leaf pores, and that's going to help them root more quickly. And now I'm going to put on my humidity dome. I'm going to put them in a low light area in the house, and I'm going to put them on my heating pad. And as soon as I start to see new growth on the mint, or I start to see that some of my plants, my chamomile is germinating, and maybe my rosemary still looks really, looks a little wilted, and I'm not ready to put it under strong light. Well, in that case, I am going to take a pair of scissors, which I probably don't have handy with me right now, and I'm going to cut this tray into, I could have a 1x4 section for each one of these plantings. And then I can take the seed, like for example, I think I have an example of that right here. So I had this is actually some chamomile right here. And I cut a very small section of the chamomile away from the larger pack. And now this I can put underneath light. The only thing I will tell you is you can see I have really great establishment on one side and not so great on the other side. Chamomile is so delicate that when you get it close to your light, LED, fluorescent, whatever it may be, you have to be very careful to keep the top of the soil moist. That spray bottle will work really well, because even with just a little bit of temperature increase, you can really fry fine seedlings like this. That is not going to be the case for 90% of the seeds. And I don't think any of you guys got seeds where that's going to be a major issue. But you can cut this tray really simply, and then and they'll all still fit back in together. So when the rosemary and everything's ready for light again, you can put it all back together and use the basin, which is really handy for watering, like I mentioned. You probably won't need the humidity dome after germination for the seed, and after your cuttings start to look like they're standing up straight and putting on new growth. The humidity dome just then becomes potential for you know, unnecessary moisture sitting on the plant and potential for disease and pests. So once I've got them all where I want them to be, germinating, putting on new growth, rooting, and with these cuttings, or excuse me, with these plug trays, the thing I really like is that they are see-through. So you're probably not going to see it for some time, but you are going to start to see root development on these cuttings, and you'll know with pretty good certainty that they're established and ready for stronger light. In that case, I come back to maybe the most important element of the kit, which was the flexible desk lamp fixture and the 9-watt LED grow bulb from GE. And let's see, and I'm trying to see what angle we're looking at here. Yeah. And so I'm taking this on the side of my work table right here. I'm trying to, the reason why we really liked this bulb is because it's so lightweight. It's 9 watts, and I believe it's less than half a pound. It's like 0.5, or excuse me, it's like 5.6 ounces or something, which makes the use with the flexible desk lamp possible. We looked at a lot of different grow light possibilities for this class. And like, for example, Philips makes a really nice, these kind of look like flood lamps. They have built-in reflectors in them. So you don't need, like standard clamp lights are gonna come with a reflector like this. And this is just, like I said, a standard, they call them E26 bulbs. These are like the standard bulbs that you might replace incandescent bulbs with in your house. And this is a 5,000 Kelvin, so it's a cool light bulb. But this doesn't have any built-in optics. It doesn't have any way to focus the light on the plants. And so that's why you need this reflector, which is fine. And I grow a lot of plants just using this $3 bulb and this reflector shade. The thing that's nice about the GE bulb is that it has the reflector built into it. And so it's gonna focus the light at a 60-degree angle. And generally speaking, for starting seed, I probably wanna be pretty close. So in this situation, if I'm really trying to keep everything together and keep everything confined in this space, then I am probably trying to direct the closest proximity with the light to my germinating seeds. And this is really bright on camera. Looks okay in the overhead, right? This is sort of a cooler light. It has, if you look at it, I wouldn't suggest staring into it like you don't want to stare into the sun, but you can see that there is some red built into it along with some of the cooler blue lights with it, if you look inside the diodes inside the light. And generally speaking, for germinating seed, I'm trying to get really close. And the way that this light it has plenty of power, it puts out plenty of light in quantity and quality, but because of how it's shaped, it sometimes will leave, if you're using this whole tray to germinate seed, you might be having some plants that are leaning forward or closer towards the light. And like I said, that's just because of how the light is angled. One workaround, I kind of talked about this in the slides, are if you have a house that has white walls like I do, and you can put it in a corner, you can reflect light that way. You can also, it's not like the most handsome looking thing, but you can really build in a lot more, you can trap a lot more of the light and make sure that it's directed towards your plants by just using, like, this is some leftover tinfoil that we had in the kitchen, and I can just kind of loosely squeeze it around the edges. And now even those plants that are on the far side, and I can put it on the back side too, I can make like a little cube like this, and this like significantly increases the quantity of light that is hitting the plant canopy in this case. And you could use a light bulb like this in a variety of different ways to increase the amount of production. And this is just one really simple way. So with that, we've kind of gone over time. We'd like to answer any questions, obviously, if there are any, especially regarding the kits. If there's something you're not sure about that you got or you don't know how to use, you have any concerns about. I'm sorry
Yeah,
for we've
a couple
run a little bit
questions
over.
came up.
Yeah.
Yeah, quick question. If you're growing transplants to transplant outside, how do
Hmm.
you determine when to start like a basil plant, those types of things?
That's a really good question. I kind of hoped to give you guys a little bit more information on that, but I'll do that now. Generally speaking, I'd probably like 6 to 8 weeks. Let's see. I'd probably like 6 to 8 weeks before I put something outside. Now, with basil is one example of an herb plant that really is not tolerant of cold temperatures. It's going to prefer temperatures above 50 degrees. And so let's say, Dennis, when are we usually on average above 50 degrees in Johnson County? You're better at that.
Well, I usually tell people that the frost, you know, if you want a danger of frost to pass, which I would in basil, you're talking probably Mother's Day weekend.
Exactly. Yes. I love when you use those holiday milestones, and it helps me not forget about my mom. So, Mother's Day, you're shooting for Mother's Day and you're working 6 to 8 weeks backwards. That's when you know you need to start your basil. For something like cilantro or parsley that you're going to be able to put out like at the beginning of March, second week of March, you're working, 6 to 8 weeks back from that date. And then you're going to be the first person with, parsley or cilantro on your block. And the one thing that people generally have issues with is they plant those two crops too late, and then they're bolting or they're going to flower in the summer. So starting from transplants is a really fantastic way to avoid that. Get the plants out early. Dill, fennel, most of the other crops, especially the perennial ones, are going to be a lot more tolerant of colder temperatures. And so that's why I said, if you're starting from seed with something like rosemary, thyme, oregano, those would be some really good examples of things that just take a lot of time because they're woody plants. They're trying to put on a lot of biomass in their stem, which helps them overwinter, and so they take a long time to develop. Those would be ones I would be starting at the end of December, January, so that I have new rosemary, thyme, oregano to transplant in the spring.
Okay. The lights, Zach, do you leave
Mm-hmm.
them on 24/7? Do you put them on a timer? How long do you leave the lights on?
Yeah, really good question. I mean, this is something that didn't come in the kit, but is really low cost, and I would recommend this sort of manual timer. There's really no reason that the lights ever have to go off. None of these plants are you're not trying to create a certain type of photo period for any of these plants. You're really just trying to provide them the light intensity that they need to be healthy. And so one way that you can do that is by leaving the lights on all the time. Now, if you're like me and you live with someone else, they may not be so keen with the grow lights being on 24/7. And so usually what I do is I set them on for at least 16 hours, especially for seedlings, and they go off right when we go to bed, so they're not stimulating us before we go to bed, and then they come on like probably 30 minutes before I wake up. And luckily we've moved and have a larger space now where they can be a little bit separated from our bedroom space. But that's something to be another thing we were trying to achieve with this class was, during this period where we're being asked to isolate and we're at home a lot more and it's getting darker outside, there is some benefit to having obviously lights in our house. It helps us be more productive, and there are certain lights that are better for certain types of room and certain types of activities. And so I do think that grow lights can really have a positive effect on your mood, and there is research to suggest that's true. I would tell you, though, that with some of these bluer lights, we've probably all heard about how we're getting too much stimulation with blue lights from LEDs, TVs, cell phones. I wouldn't suggest that you have some of these lights set up in your bedroom space, for example. But they can be really nice in your kitchen.
The heat pad, how long do you leave your germinating seeds and cuttings on the heat pad before you move it off?
I have a digital thermostat, so mine turns on and off automatically. But before I ever had that, I just ran the heat pad until my seeds germinated, or with my cuttings, if I felt like there was too much moisture buildup, even with the vents open, I would sometimes turn off my heat pad in the evening. But in our new house, for these cuttings, generally, I'm leaving them on all the time until I'm convinced that they've set roots and they're ready for light.
This is more of a harvest question than a propagation question, but on the rosemary that grows so slow in the winter, is there any tricks can you take leaves without taking stems and get growth, like take the older leaves, so just pick up a few limbs, or you always have to harvest the whole stem?
Definitely can, but I would say that with the combination of a little bit of extra light, cutting the stem is actually will hopefully, and you know, from a botanical perspective, it should encourage more growth from the node below the cutting. I usually try to take the cutting right above a branching point, and that helps encourage a more bushier architecture, but the cutting should stimulate growth. And I think the light and good watering with rosemary is very finicky when it comes to water. Um, don't overwater. Like I said, the finger test, going about a knuckle deep with your index finger. And if that's dry, it's time to water. Water thoroughly until water is coming out of the drainage hole, but then don't water again until it's dried out. And good light, I think hopefully you have maybe a little bit more growth from that rosemary plant than what you're used to.
So the last question is, you recorded, how are they going to access to that? Are you going to send out to the people later then? We're on the
Yeah, we'll make the recording available. We'll make the slides available. We didn't get to cover all the materials, but in respect of everyone's time, I think we probably about time to close unless there's more Q&A. But we'll make all the resources available later this week.
I think you're caught up on questions. Got a lot of kudos for great presentation. Thank you. Those type of things are coming in. So they
keep
appreciate
those
the demos.
coming. Keep those coming. Thank you to the support team, obviously, the extension office, so many people that are involved in making these projects possible. Dennis, obviously, thank you for moderating the chat. Don't be afraid to make mistakes. If you have questions about some of the materials that you receive, we really want these to go to use, and if people feel comfortable with them. We tried to, like I said, develop the kit with different functions in mind. So maybe herbs don't end up being your thing, but you really like growing heirloom tomatoes. This would be a great kit for starting tomato seeds. This would be a great kit for starting a variety of vegetable seeds, and beyond. So really experiment and ask questions. We hope that you guys have a really happy holidays, and hopefully get to have some time to have some horticulture experiences during the holiday break. So with that, if there's no more Q&A.